Hello and welcome. I'm Al Barrows, and this is UFO Disclosure, the podcast that's meant to show an average person's reaction to all the UFO, UAP news from everywhere and anywhere. Today, I'd like to talk about the Vilas-Boas abduction, which occurred in Brazil in 1957. In October of 1957, a Brazilian farmer named Antonio Vilas-Boas had an experience that's now considered the first documented UFO abduction case in the post-war era. 4 months after the unusual events, Vilas-Boas shared his experience with a doctor and journalist. At a time when stories of UFO landings and entity encounters were dismissed out of hand, Antonio's experience was widely overlooked at first. But more than 60 years later, we see that his narrative contains many of the same elements as the common, quote, alien abduction, end quote, experience of the 80s and 90s. And it was the first to suggest a rather alarming agenda on the part of the abductions. Antonio Vilas-Boas was a 23-year-old Brazilian man living with his family on their farm near the town of São Francisco de Sales in the southeastern state of Minas Gerais. And there's a map there so you can see what part of Brazil it is. After 11 p.m. on the night of October the 5th, 1957, Antonio was trying to sleep in his room with his brother when he went to open the window. In the middle of the farmyard, he noticed a fluorescent silver light illuminating a large patch of ground with no visible source. Later, the light began moving towards him. He swung the shutters closed, and the brothers watched as the light shone through the shutters, then down between the roof tiles before it simply went out. The second event took place after 9:30 p.m., the night of October the 14th. Antonio was plowing the field in the tractor with his other brother when they saw a large, round light that shone so bright it hurt their eyes. It was light red in color and hovering at the northern end of the field, an estimated 100 meters in the air, lighting up the ground below. Antonio felt there was an object behind the light, but when he walked closer, the light quickly moved to the southern end of the field. Antonio tried approaching it 20 times, but it kept switching locations. For the next while, it occasionally shot out rays in all directions, then appeared to vanish, as though it had been turned out, as Antonio put it. The next day, October the 15th, Antonio was plowing alone. At 1 a.m., he spotted a red star in the clear sky that was quickly growing in size as it appeared to fly towards him. Soon he could see that it was shaped like an elongated egg, similar to the one mentioned by the craft retrieval expert Jake Barber, who's been in social media recently. And this elongated egg was emitting a brilliant pale red light. The object stopped over top of Antonio's tractor, then descended to a height of roughly 50 meters. Or 160 feet, roughly. The area was lit as though it were daylight, with a powerful pale red glow. The UFO then moved 10 to 15 meters in front of the tractor and slowly descended, or roughly 50 feet away from the tractor. Vilas-Boas could now see that the egg-shaped machine was surrounded by small purple-colored lights and had a small square-shaped metal plane sticking out of either side. It also had 3 metal spikes protruding from the front, aligned horizontally. Above each of the 2 outer spikes was a round reddish light, and above the central one was a powerful red headlight, as he put it, that appeared to be the source of the brilliant glow he'd seen before. The upper part of the craft was shaped like a shallow dome, and it spun on its own axes. So it sounds like the top part of the craft was moving separately from the lower half. The spinning dome gave off a powerful red fluorescent light, which changed to a green color when the craft came to land and the spinning slowed. So it becomes green when it's getting ready to land. A tripod of metal supports came out from beneath the object before it landed on the ground, prompting Vilas-Boas to drive his tractor away. But he only got a few meters before the engine died and the lights went out. Vilas-Boas had just started running when someone grabbed his arm from the side. His assailant was completely covered in a suit and helmet and stood about as tall as Antonio's shoulder. So not quite as tall as Antonio. As he struggled away, he was grabbed by 3 more taller figures. Okay, so now he's got 4 of these humanoids grabbing him in the same full body suits who lifted him off the ground. Vilas-Boas struggled and yelled, and curiously, each time that he spoke or yelled, the 4 assailants stopped to look at his face. That's interesting. They were interested by his reaction or his extreme emotion, I guess. The suited entities were each clothed in tight-fitting, full-body jumpsuits made of thick gray cloth with a few black bands around the limbs. The suit joined a helmet of the same color, which revealed their light bluish eyes only through 2 round holes. Okay, so these aliens had blue eyes. Their helmets seemed overly large above the eye line. Okay, I'm not sure what that means. Could possibly mean that they have larger heads or elongated heads, possibly. 3 silver-colored tubes the size of garden hoses came from the bottom of the back of their helmets and curved down to fit into the back of the suit. Okay, some sort of life support system. In the center of the chest was a small, round, red shield that reflected light. Could possibly be some sort of a flashlight. And a strip of silvery material joined the shield to a tight, broad belt with no clasp or buckle. Okay, so the belt might be the source of the power for what I'm calling a flashlight. The sleeves blended into thick, 5-fingered gloves of the same color. So they had 5 fingers. Okay, and the pants joined seamlessly to tennis-style shoes with soles that were 2 or 3 inches thick. There are many abduction stories where the aliens, after this, because this was early on in the abduction stories, this was actually even before the Barney and Benny Hill abduction became famous. From there on in, we get a lot of stories similar to this where the aliens have form-fitting suits that are seamless. Vilas-Boas was carried to the craft, which was sitting roughly 2 meters above the ground, or roughly 6 feet above the ground. There was an open doorway towards the rear of the craft, with the door laying outward horizontally like a castle drawbridge door, which appeared to be made of the same silvery metal as the craft's walls. The assailants forced Antonio onto the ladder, and he realized that it was somehow flexible and swung from side to side as he struggled. Okay, I don't think I've ever heard that before, that a ladder that's flexible is used by aliens to get in and out of their craft. It's a new one for me, anyway. He was taken inside the UFO, and Antonio found himself inside a small, square room made entirely of polished metal. At the top of the walls and in the ceiling were many small square lights set into the surface, so recessed lighting. In other words, the assailants set Antonio down as the door raised up and closed, and the door blended so seamlessly with the walls around it that the frame could not be seen at all. There were 5 of the beings around him at this point, and one used a hand to signal Antonio to move to an open door opposite the entrance. Okay, so they're not pushing him around. They're using hand signals to direct him at this point. Antonio entered into a much larger semi-oval shaped room with the same polished metal walls and lighting, and a column in the center. To one side of the room, Antonio saw an oddly shaped table, surrounded by chairs like bar stools, all made of white metal. Antonio stood, waiting while the five entities appeared to speak to each other in what he described as slow barks and yelps. And that's reminiscent of what James Hall described his tall white aliens language sounding like barks and yelps. James Hall also said that the tall whites also made noises like birds. James Hall, of course, being famous for his hospitality series books on his encounters with tall whites at the Nellis Air Force Base where he was stationed as a weatherman. Moving on, the barking stopped and the assailants, or the aliens, all grabbed him and started taking off his clothes. One of them approached him with a soft, wet sponge. Okay, so it sounds like they're cleaning or decontaminating him, as is often the case in many abductions where they're found on the ship and cleaned before they're handled, which it used to cover him in a thick, clear liquid that dried quickly and was not oily. 3 of his assailants led him through a door opposite to where they had entered by pushing something in the middle, which caused it to open inwards in 2 halves. Above the door were illuminated red symbols, which appeared to float about 2 inches in front of the door frame. They sort of looked like hieroglyphic symbols. If you guys can see this above the door frame there. Vilas-Boas walked through the door into a squarish room, and once again, the door closed seamlessly with the wall around it. Okay, so I guess the doors really are invisible until they open. Shortly after, 2 more of the beings entered, each carrying a thick red tube, a glass flask shaped like a chalice on one end, and a kind of cupping glass on the other. One of the aliens squeezed the tube, seemingly pressing the air out of it, before he placed the cupping glass on Antonio's chin. Antonio felt a bit of suction while the flask filled halfway with what looked like blood. The second tube was placed on the other side of his chin, and the chalice was filled to the brim. Okay, so they're collecting blood from him. Not sure why. The aliens then left with the door closing behind them. In the 2 spots where the tubes touched his chin, there appeared a dark mark that itched and burned, and was still visible 4 months later. Okay, so these marks from where they extracted blood on each side of his chin left marks that were still visible after 4 months. Antonio was then left alone in a room that contained a strangely shaped large gray couch or bed, and he was still naked at this point, mind you. He eventually began to notice a smell that he compared to burning painted cloth, and found that there were several metallic rods protruding from the walls, with many small holes in them, emitting a gray smoke into the air. Okay, so he's being drugged by some sort of vapor in the air. Antonio quickly became nauseous and then threw up in a corner of the room. Okay, so whatever that was, it was powerful enough to make him regurgitate. After a long wait, Antonio was startled by a noise, and he looked to see a naked woman in the open doorway. Antonio described her as being more beautiful than any woman he had ever seen before, but unusual in several ways. She had white skin, and her hair was bleached blonde and straight, though it curled inwards at the end. The woman's underarm and pubic hair were blood red, and her arms were covered in freckles. So she's a very fair female alien, but she did have big, elongated blue eyes that narrowed to fine points on the outsides. So her eyes were your typical grays, oversized and elongated, narrowing to fine points on the outsides. And of course, they were slanted downwards towards the middle. She had high cheekbones, a wide face, and a pointed chin. Okay, so the pointed chin is reminiscent of the grays as well. High cheekbones, the blonde hair is also reminiscent of what they say Nordic extraterrestrials look like. She had a slender body and a small waist, but wide hips and large thighs. Finally, she had small feet with long and narrow hands. Okay, so the long and narrow hands, that's definitely reminiscent of what the grays look like as well. Antonio estimated that the helmet would have brought her height up to his chin, making him certain that this woman was the first assailant to grab him outside. The woman suddenly embraced Vilas-Boas, rubbing her head against his face, and he became more aroused than he had ever been before. As the two had sexual intercourse, the woman grunted a few times, which made Antonio feel as though she were more animal than human. So I guess the grunts were not very human-like. After he'd finished inside of her, the door opened again, and one of the suited figures appeared and called to the woman. Before leaving, she turned to face Antonio, pointed to her belly, pointed at him, and then pointed up to the sky with a slight smile on her face. Next, one of the beings returned Antonio's clothes and led him back to the oval room, where the alien joined 3 other crew members now sitting on the stools. There was a third doorway in the room that was slightly ajar. And in the room beyond, Antonio could hear noises like a person shuffling around. He also noticed that on the table was a square box with a glass lid protecting what appeared to be a clock face. Like a clock, it had a hand and black marks at the 3, 6, and 9 o'clock positions, and 4 little marks in a row at 12. Antonio saw one of the aliens glance at this object a few times, but he never saw the hand move. When Antonio grabbed the device off the table, the nearest extraterrestrial darted over and snatched it from him, placing it back on the table. So whatever it was certainly important. Eventually, one of the aliens got up and signaled for Antonio to follow him. The pair walked through the room they'd originally entered from and out the exterior door. Then along the catwalk that wrapped around the craft, there was reddish square lamps embedded along the hull, where Vilas-Boas saw purple ones before. The entity pointed out the 3 metal spikes at the front of the craft. At this time, they were glowing a pale red. The catwalk stopped ahead of a large, thick sheet of murky glass that appeared to be a windshield. The crew member pointed up to the top of the craft where the big disc was slowly rotating, now illuminated by a greenish fluorescent light. And Vilas-Boas could hear a whining sound like a vacuum cleaner. The pair returned to the entrance, and the crew member gestured for Antonio to descend the ladder. Back on the ground, he saw the entity point at himself, point to the ground, and then point at the southern sky before signaling Antonio to step back. So I guess as opposed to a lot of the abduction reports that we hear later on, these extraterrestrials are not communicating with Antonio through telepathy. They're using hand signals. So after Antonio stepped back, the alien went into the craft before the door closed and the ladder's rungs collapsed together and disappeared into the wall. The legs folded into the UFO as it rose, and the top spun faster, changing between several different colors before becoming a vibrant red. A loud hum or whine could be heard as the craft quickly changed orientation, then flew southward at a fantastic speed. Vilas-Boas thought he saw a rudder move when it turned. After the craft flew off, Vilas-Boas returned to his tractor and found that the battery was disconnected. So it was actually not deactivated. It was just manually disconnected, which is unusual. Usually when we hear of machinery or cars not functioning, it's not because it's been manually disconnected. In this case, Vilas-Boas said that his battery was actually disconnected from the tractor cable. It was now just before dawn, and he estimated that he had been on the craft from 1:15 a.m. to 5:30 a.m. So almost 4 hours. He felt weak and tired and slept until 4:30 that afternoon, at which point he felt well enough to eat dinner. But the following nights, his dreams replayed the disturbing events and shocked him awake. He also experienced nausea, headaches, and loss of appetite. The second night, he felt a burning sensation in his eyes, which grew worse the next day. For the next month, he felt excessively sleepy, even drifting off during the day. The day after his abduction ended, Antonio returned to the landing site. He measured the lengths between the 3 indentations left in the ground. From this, he was able to determine that the craft was around 10.6 meters or 35 feet long, and 7 meters or 23 feet wide at the rear. So it's wider at the front than the rear. 8 days after the incident, Antonio bumped his forearm, resulting in a bruise and bleeding, which became infected and itchy and left a purple patch around it when it healed. In the following 10 days, Antonio found similar wounds appear spontaneously on his forearms and legs, each of which left behind a purple patch that remained for months. Okay, so he's having all these physical symptoms from having been on the extraterrestrial craft, and they last for at least 4 months. 15 days after the incident, a pale yellow spot appeared on each side of his nose. Okay. Could be radiation poisoning. In November of 1957, Vilas-Boas read Walt Martin's articles on Brazilian UFOs in the weekly magazine O Cruzeiro. He wrote 2 letters to Martins and sent a wood model of the UFO that he'd carved. A little over 4 months after the incident, on February the 22nd, 1958, Vilas-Boas met with Martins and also physician and ufologist Dr. Olavo T. Fontes in Rio de Janeiro. Martins and Fontes recorded over 4 hours of cross-examination, and Dr. Fontes also conducted a medical evaluation, but he could not explain the 2 small hyperchronic patches on his chin or the purple patches around his wounds. Years later, Dr. Fontes said that he felt that the symptoms were due to radiation poisoning. Of course, Antonio maintained the veracity of his account until his death on January the 17th, 1991. The story of Vilas-Boas was largely disbelieved in its own time, but after the Betty and Barney Hill case of 1961 brought the phenomenon of alien abduction to popular attention, it was clear that his case was a forerunner to the Betty and Barney Hill case. Just as the case of Vilas-Boas, Betty and Barney Hill saw a UFO before being apprehended by alien beings and led aboard a landed craft. Pregnancy was a theme in both accounts, with Betty being tested for it. And many more abductees or experiencers have reported sexual intercourse with apparently alien beings or alien-human hybrids. Hybrid reproduction was a common theme in stories collected by abduction researchers in the 1980s and 1990s, including John Mack, Bud Hopkins, and David Jacobs. And many experiencers today claim to have reproductive sex with extraterrestrial or interdimensional entities. However, other ufologists, such as Jacques Vallée, have criticized the heavy use of regressive hypnosis in these cases and warned that Hopkins and others might have unintentionally implanted false memories in their subjects. So this running theme of having had sex or hybrid children with extraterrestrial still goes on today.
Hello everybody, hi to all. This is Cello of Golden Noma Creation and Create Disclosure. So good to be back with all of you again today. I'm going on my walk and talk hike.
We're just going on our normal walk and talk hike, folks. Just heading down, doing a little vlog.
And I just wanted to give you guys an update about what's going on with me.
Awesome, an update vlog. Love them.
I have made a video recently talking about how I communicate with my hybrid alien children.
Said this is an update on the psychic communication with her hybrid reptilian son, Drayan.
I just wanted to make a quick update about that and let you guys know what's going on with that. So you guys understand a little bit more about the process, how it works, and how the parents of hybrid alien children are able to consistently communicate with their children. Recently, I had a contact experience with my hybrid alien son, Drayan, and he is part reptilian and part human.
Oh!
Okay, so that was Ted Nivison on that podcast, interviewing a young lady that believes that she has hybrid children that she can still communicate with. Okay, so besides reported sexual encounters with aliens that seems to be still going on, we also had recently a group of veterans that used to work at Area 51 that are now reporting symptoms of radiation poisoning, similar to what Vilas-Boas was reporting back in the 1950s. And famous ufologist and author Jacques Vallée, which is an icon in the UFO culture, went on Somewhere in the Skies podcast and spoke about injuries associated with contact with UAP.
You know, I looked into and I published a number of cases of casualty, of death in Brazil, and cases where people were injured. I have published photographs of some of the injuries, both on male and female patients. And the question is, you know, are we like going to be faced with something that comes here? You asked me the question at the beginning about injuries, you know. Well, the injuries, this phenomenon doesn't seem to care if it kills people or if it injures people.
Okay, so that's pretty ominous, his statement there. Whether intentional or unintentional, he believes that NHI is indifferent to injuring or killing people. I'd like to finish up with Jacques Vallée's closing statements as to how one might react if a UFO landed in your own backyard.
You can go touch it, you know. Dr. Green has all these files that we've worked on together to some extent, and he's continued to develop, you know, protocols to deal with these patients of people who are exposed to something that we really don't understand. That in some cases it is obviously hostile. Now, you know, if I touch a burning bulb, it's going to burn me. It's not hostile, but I know not to do that. And we don't understand that process with UFOs. Should we tell people, yes, if something lands in your backyard, you can go touch it, you know? Well, some people have done it, and, with no harm. And some people have done it and were irradiated, to a dangerous extent for life. And so all those questions are the questions people are going to start asking now, and they should. And we don't have the answers. And we have not prepared the scientific structure to go get the answers.
Okay. So, I don't know. Is it true some people might have touched UAP and not been radiated? I'd probably keep my distance at first, but I'd certainly be curious. Now, he also raises a question. Are we ready for disclosure? Are we scientifically prepared to deal with NHI, even though contact might be harmful to us physically? These are all questions that we should all be asking ourselves. We're all eager for disclosure, for contact, but are we truly ready? My name is Al Barrows. This has been UFO Disclosure. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Thanks. Thanks for listening to my podcast.